Book 3, Chapter 5 of Resurrection. Until they left Perm, Nekhludoff only twice managed to see Katusha, once in Nijni, before the prisoners were embarked on a barge surrounded by a wire netting, and again in Perm, in the prison office. At both these interviews he found her reserved and unkind. She answered his questions as to whether she was in want of anything and whether she was comfortable, evasively and bashfully, and, as he thought, with the same feeling of hostile reproach which she had shown several times before. Her depressed state of mind, which was only the result of the molestations from the men that she was undergoing at the time, tormented Nekhludoff. He feared lest, influenced by the hard and degrading circumstances in which she was placed on the journey, she should again get into that state of despair and discord with her own self which formerly made her irritable with him, and which had caused her to drink and smoke excessively to gain oblivion. But he was unable to help her in any way during this part of the journey, as it was impossible for him to be with her. It was only when she joined the political prisoners that he saw how unfounded his fears were, and at each interview he noticed that inner change he so strongly desired to see in her becoming more and more marked. The first time they met in Tomsk, she was again just as she had been when leaving Moscow. She did not frown or become confused when she saw him, but met him joyfully and simply, thanking him for what he had done for her, especially for bringing her among the people with whom she now was. After 2 months marching with the gang, the change that had taken place within her became noticeable in her appearance. She grew sunburned and thinner, and seemed older. Wrinkles appeared on her temples and round her mouth. She had no ringlets on her forehead now, and her hair was covered with a kerchief. In the way it was arranged, as well as in her dress and her manners, there was no trace of coquetry left, and this change, which had taken place and was still progressing in her, made Nekhludoff very happy. He felt for her something he had never experienced before. This feeling had nothing in common with his first poetic love for her, and even less with the sensual love that had followed, nor even with the satisfaction of a duty fulfilled, not unmixed with self-admiration, with which he decided to marry her after the trial. The present feeling was simply one of pity and tenderness. He had felt it when he met her in prison for the first time, and then again when, after conquering his repugnance, he forgave her the imagined intrigue with the medical assistant in the hospital. The injustice done her had since been discovered. It was the same feeling he now had, only with this difference, that formerly it was momentary, and that now it had become permanent. Whatever he was doing, whatever he was thinking now, a feeling of pity and tenderness dwelt with him, and not only pity and tenderness for her, but for everybody. This feeling seemed to have opened the floodgates of love, which had found no outlet in Nekhludoff's soul, and the love now flowed out to everyone he met. During this journey Nekhludoff's feelings were so stimulated that he could not help being attentive and considerate to everybody, from the coachman and the convoy soldiers to the prison inspectors and governors whom he had to deal with. Now that Maslova was among the political prisoners, Nekhludoff could not help becoming acquainted with many of them, first in Ekaterinburg, where they had a good deal of freedom and were kept all together in a large cell, and then on the road, when Maslova was marching with 3 of the men and 4 of the women. Coming in contact with political exiles in this way made Nekhludoff completely change his mind concerning them. From the very beginning of the revolutionary movement in Russia, but especially since that 1st of March, when Alexander II was murdered, Nekhludoff regarded the revolutionists with dislike and contempt. He was repulsed by the cruelty and secrecy of the methods they employed in their struggles against the government, especially the cruel murders they committed, and their arrogance also disgusted him. But having learned more intimately to know them and all they had suffered at the hands of the government, he saw that they could not be other than they were. Terrible and endless as were the torments which were inflicted on the criminals, there was at least some semblance of justice shown them before and after they were sentenced. But in the case of the political prisoners, there was not even that semblance, as Nekhludoff saw in the case of Sholostova and that of many and many of his new acquaintances. These people were dealt with like fish caught with a net. Everything that gets into the nets is pulled ashore, and then the big fish which are required are sorted out, and the little ones are left to perish unheeded on the shore. Having captured hundreds that were evidently guiltless, and that could not be dangerous to the government, they left them imprisoned for years, where they became consumptive, went out of their minds, or committed suicide, and kept them only because they had no inducement to set them free, while they might be of use to elucidate some question at a judicial inquiry, safe in prison. The fate of these persons, often innocent even from the government point of view, depended on the whim, the humour of, or the amount of leisure at the disposal of some police officer or spy or public prosecutor or magistrate or governor or minister. Some one of these officials feels dull or inclined to distinguish himself and makes a number of arrests and imprisons or sets free according to his own fancy or that of the higher authorities. And the higher official, actuated by like motives, according to whether he is inclined to distinguish himself or to what his relations to the minister are, exiles men to the other side of the world, or keeps them in solitary confinement, condemns them to Siberia, to hard labour, to death, or sets them free at the request of some lady. They were dealt with as in war, and they naturally employed the means that were used against them. And as the military men live in an atmosphere of public opinion that not only conceals from them the guilt of their actions, but sets these actions up as feats of heroism, so these political offenders were also constantly surrounded by an atmosphere of public opinion which made the cruel actions they committed, in the face of danger and at the risk of liberty and life and all that is dear to men, seem not wicked but glorious actions. Nekhludoff found in this the explanation of the surprising phenomenon that men with the mildest characters, who seemed incapable of witnessing the sufferings of any living creature, much less of inflicting pain, quietly prepared to murder men, nearly all of them considering murder lawful and just on certain occasions as a means for self-defence, for the attainment of higher aims, or for the general welfare. The importance they attribute to their cause, and consequently to themselves, flowed naturally from the importance the government attached to their actions, and the cruelty of the punishments it inflicted on them. When Nekhludoff came to know them better, he became convinced that they were not the right-down villains that some imagined them to be, nor the complete heroes that others thought them, but ordinary people, just the same as others, among whom there were some good and some bad, and some mediocre, as there are everywhere. There were some among them who had turned revolutionists because they honestly considered it their duty to fight the existing evils. But there were also those who chose this work for selfish, ambitious motives. The majority, however, was attracted to the revolutionary idea by the desire for danger, for risks, the enjoyment of playing with one's life, which, as Nekhludoff knew from his military experiences, is quite common to the most ordinary people while they are young and full of energy. But wherein they differed from ordinary people was that their moral standard was a higher one than that of ordinary men. They considered not only self-control, hard living, truthfulness, but also the readiness to sacrifice everything, even life, for the common welfare as their duty. Therefore the best among them stood on a moral level that is not often reached, while the worst were far below the ordinary level, many of them being untruthful, hypocritical, and at the same time self-satisfied and proud, so that Nekhludoff learned not only to respect but to love some of his new acquaintances, while he remained more than indifferent to others. End of chapter 5 of book 3. Book 3, Chapter 6 of Resurrection. Nekhludoff grew especially fond of Kryltsov, a consumptive young man condemned to hard labour, who was going with the same gang as Katusha. Nekhludoff had made his acquaintance already in Ekaterinburg, and talked with him several times on the road after that. Once, in summer, Nekhludoff spent nearly the whole of a day with him at a halting station, and Kryltzoff, having once started talking, told him his story and how he had become a revolutionist. Up to the time of his imprisonment his story was soon told. He lost his father, a rich landed proprietor in the south of Russia, when still a child. He was the only son, and his mother brought him up. He learned easily in the university as well as the gymnasium, and was first in the mathematical faculty in his year. He was offered a choice of remaining in the university or going abroad. He hesitated. He loved a girl and was thinking of marriage and taking part in the rural administration. He did not like giving up either offer and could not make up his mind. At this time his fellow students at the university asked him for money for a common cause. He did not know that this common cause was revolutionary, which he was not interested in at that time, but gave the money from a sense of comradeship and vanity, so that it should not be said that he was afraid. Those who received the money were caught. A note was found which proved that the money had been given by Kryltzoff. He was arrested, and first kept at the police station, then imprisoned. The prison where I was put, Kryltzoff went on to relate. He was sitting on the high shelf bedstead, his elbows on his knees, with sunken chest, the beautiful, intelligent eyes with which he looked at Nekhludoff glistening feverishly. They were not specially strict in that prison. We managed to converse, not only by tapping the wall, but could walk about the corridors, share our provisions and our tobacco, and in the evenings we even sang in chorus. I had a fine voice. Yes, if it had not been for mother, it would have been all right, even pleasant and interesting. Here I made the acquaintance of the famous Petrov. He afterwards killed himself with a piece of glass at the fortress, and also of others, but I was not yet a revolutionary. I also became acquainted with my neighbours in the cells next to mine. They were both caught with Polish proclamations and arrested in the same cause, and were tried for an attempt to escape from the convoy when they were being taken to the railway station. One was a Pole, Lozinski, the other a Jew, Rozovsky. Yes, well, this Rozovsky was quite a boy. He said he was 17, but he looked 15, thin, small, active, with black sparkling eyes, and, like most Jews, very musical. His voice was still breaking, and yet he sang beautifully. Yes, I saw them both taken to be tried. They were taken in the morning, they returned in the evening, and said they were condemned to death. No one had expected it. Their case was so unimportant. They only tried to get away from the convoy, and had not even wounded anyone. And then it was so unnatural to execute such a child as Rozovsky. And we in prison all came to the conclusion that it was only done to frighten them and would not be confirmed. At first we were excited, and then we comforted ourselves, and life went on as before. Yes, well, one evening a watchman comes to my door and mysteriously announces to me that carpenters had arrived and were putting up the gallows. At first I did not understand. What's that? What gallows? But the watchman was so excited that I saw at once it was for our two. I wished to tap and communicate with my comrades, but was afraid those two would hear. The comrades were also silent. Evidently everybody knew. In the corridors and in the cells everything was as still as death all that evening. They did not tap the wall nor sing. At 10 the watchman came in again and announced that a hangman had arrived from Moscow. He said it and went away. I began calling him back. Suddenly I hear Rozovsky shouting to me across the corridor, "What's the matter? Why do you call him?" I answered something about asking him to get me some tobacco, but he seemed to guess and asked me, "Why did we not sing tonight? Why did we not tap the walls?" I do not remember what I said, but I went away so as not to speak to him. Yes, it was a terrible night. I listened to every sound all night. Suddenly, towards morning, I hear doors opening and somebody walking, many persons. I went up to my window. There was a lamp burning in the corridor. The first to pass was the inspector. He was stout and seemed a resolute, self-satisfied man, but he looked ghastly pale, downcast, and seemed frightened. Then his assistant, frowning but resolute. Behind them the watchman. They passed my door and stopped at the next, and I hear the assistant calling out in a strange voice, "Lazinski, get up and put on clean linen." Yes, then I hear the creaking of the door. They entered into his cell. Then I hear Lazinski's steps going to the opposite side of the corridor. I could only see the inspector. He stood quite pale and buttoned and unbuttoned his coat, shrugging his shoulders. Yes. Then, as if frightened of something, he moved out of the way. It was Lazinski, who passed him and came up to my door. A handsome young fellow he was, you know, of that nice Polish type, broad-shouldered, his head covered with fine, fair, curly hair, as with a cap, and with beautiful blue eyes, so blooming, so fresh, so healthy. He stopped in front of my window so that I could see the whole of his face. A dreadful, gaunt, livid face. "Kryltzoff, have you seen any cigarettes?" I wished to pass him some, but the assistant hurriedly pulled out his cigarette case and passed it to him. He took out one, the assistant struck a match, and he lit the cigarette and began to smoke, and seemed to be thinking. Then, as if he had remembered something, he began to speak. "It is cruel and unjust. I have committed no crime. I saw something quiver in his white young throat, from which I could not take my eyes. And he stopped. Yes. At that moment I hear Rozovsky shouting in his fine Jewish voice. Lazinski threw away the cigarette and stepped from the door, and Rozovsky appeared at the window. His childish face, with the limpid black eyes, was red and moist. He also had clean linen on. The trousers were too wide, and he kept pulling them up and trembled all over. He approached his pitiful face to my window. "Kryltzoff, it's true that the doctor has prescribed cough mixture for me, is it not? I am not well. I'll take some more of the mixture." No one answered, and he looked inquiringly, now at me, now at the inspector. What he meant to say I never made out. Yes. Suddenly the assistant again put on a stern expression and called out in a kind of squeaking tone, "Now then, no nonsense. Let us go." Rozovsky seemed incapable of understanding what awaited him, and hurried, almost ran in front of him along the corridor. But then he drew back, and I could hear his shrill voice and his cries, then the trampling of feet and general hubbub. He was shrieking and sobbing. The sounds came fainter and fainter, and at last the door rattled, and all was quiet. Yes. And so they hanged them, throttled them both with a rope. A watchman, another one, saw it done and told me that Lazinski did not resist, but Rozovsky struggled for a long time, so that they had to pull him up onto the scaffold and to force his head into the noose. Yes, this watchman was a stupid fellow. He said, "They told me, sir, that it would be frightful, but it was not at all frightful. After they were hanged, they only shrugged their shoulders twice, like this." He showed how the shoulders convulsively rose and fell. Then the hangman pulled a bit so as to tighten the noose, and it was all up, and they never budged. And Kryltzoff repeated the watchman's words, "Not at all frightful," and tried to smile, but burst into sobs instead. For a long time after that he kept silent, breathing heavily and repressing the sobs that were choking him. From that time I became a revolutionist. "Yes," he said, when he was quieter, and finished his story in a few words. He belonged to the Narodovoltzy party, and was even at the head of the disorganising group, whose object was to terrorise the government, so that it should give up its power of its own accord. With this object he travelled to Petersburg, to Kiev, to Odessa, and abroad, and was everywhere successful. A man in whom he had full confidence betrayed him. He was arrested, tried, kept in prison for 2 years, and condemned to death, but the sentence was mitigated to one of hard labour for life. He went into consumption while in prison, and in the conditions he was now placed he had scarcely more than a few months longer to live. This he knew, but did not repent of his actions, but said that if he had another life he would use it in the same way to destroy the conditions in which such things as he had seen were possible. This man's story and his intimacy with him explained to Nekhludoff much that he had not previously understood. End of chapter 6 of book 3.